The Arab slave trade, often overshadowed by the transatlantic slave trade, was a significant and enduring aspect of global history. Spanning over a millennium, from the 7th century to the early 20th century, the Arab slave trade involved the capture, transportation, and enslavement of millions of people across vast regions of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. This article delves into the origins, practices, impacts, and legacy of the Arab slave trade, shedding light on a complex and multifaceted chapter of human history. The Arab slave trade began in the early years of Islam, around the 7th century. The expansion of the Islamic Empire facilitated the growth of trade networks across the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, and beyond. These networks were crucial for the movement of goods, people, and ideas, including the practice of slavery. Islamic teachings, while acknowledging the existence of slavery, advocated for the humane treatment of slaves and encouraged manumission. However, the demand for labor in agricultural, domestic, and military sectors fueled the continued practice of slavery. Enslaved individuals were sourced from various regions, including sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and Europe. Africa was the primary source of slaves for the Arab trade. Major slave markets emerged in North African cities such as Cairo, Tunis, and Tripoli. The trans-Saharan trade routes played a crucial role in transporting captives from sub-Saharan Africa to these markets. Slaves were captured through raids, wars, and trading agreements with local African leaders. The East African coast, particularly Zanzibar, also became a significant hub for the Arab slave trade. From there, slaves were transported across the Indian Ocean to destinations in the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent. In the Middle East, slaves were employed in various roles, including domestic service, agricultural labor, and military service. The Abbasid Caliphate 750-1258 saw a significant influx of slaves, particularly in its capital, Baghdad. The Mamluk Sultanate 1250-1517 in Egypt and the Levant was another prominent player, with military slaves, Mamluks, forming the backbone of its armed forces. In Asia, the Arab slave trade reached as far as India, where slaves were used in domestic and military roles. The influence of Arab traders extended to Southeast Asia, where they established trading posts and integrated into local societies. The Arab slave trade involved various forms of slavery, including domestic servitude, agricultural labor, military service, and concubinage. Domestic slaves were employed in households, performing tasks such as cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Agricultural slaves worked on plantations and estates, producing crops like sugar, cotton, and spices. Military slavery was a unique feature of the Arab slave trade. Enslaved soldiers, known as Mamluks, were often captured as children, trained, and converted to Islam. They served as elite troops in the armies of Islamic states and, in some cases, rose to significant positions of power. The treatment of slaves varied widely depending on their roles and the regions they were in. Domestic slaves often experienced better conditions compared to those in agriculture, who endured harsh labor and poor living conditions. Military slaves, while subjected to rigorous training and discipline, could attain significant social mobility and power. Islamic law provided some protections for slaves, including the right to humane treatment and the possibility of manumission. However, these protections were not always upheld, and the reality of slavery was often brutal and dehumanizing. The Arab slave trade had profound demographic impacts on the regions involved. In Africa, the extraction of millions of people, particularly young men and women, disrupted social structures and contributed to long-term population imbalances. The trade also facilitated the spread of African diaspora communities across the Middle East and Asia. The Arab slave trade played a significant role in the economies of the Islamic world. The labor of enslaved people was essential for agricultural production, domestic service, and military power. In Africa, the trade stimulated local economies through the exchange of slaves for goods such as textiles, firearms, and luxury items. The Arab slave trade contributed to the cultural and social dynamics of the regions it touched. Enslaved individuals brought their languages, traditions, and religious practices, influencing the cultures of their new environments. In the Islamic world, African slaves contributed to the development of arts, music, and cuisine. The trade also led to the establishment of racially and ethnically diverse societies. Interactions between Arabs, Africans, and other groups resulted in complex social hierarchies and systems of racial classification. Enslaved individuals resisted their conditions in various ways, from subtle acts of defiance to outright rebellion. Notable revolts include the Zanj Rebellion, 869 to 883, where East African slaves in the Abbasid Caliphate rose up against their masters. Although the rebellion was ultimately suppressed, it highlighted the resilience and agency of enslaved people. The abolition of the Arab slave trade was a gradual process influenced by various factors, including economic changes, political pressures, and moral arguments. European colonial powers, particularly the British, played a significant role in suppressing the trade in the 19th century as part of their broader anti-slavery campaigns. In the Islamic world, the abolition of slavery was a complex process, influenced by internal reforms and external pressures. Countries such as Saudi Arabia and Oman officially abolished slavery in the mid-20th century, though the legacy of slavery continues to affect these societies. The legacy of the Arab slave trade is multifaceted and enduring. It has left an indelible mark on the demographics, economies, and cultures of the regions involved. The descendants of enslaved people continue to grapple with the historical and contemporary impacts of slavery, including issues of identity, social status, and racial discrimination. The trade also underscores the importance of a comprehensive understanding of global slavery. While the transatlantic slave trade is often the focal point of discussions on slavery, the Arab slave trade reminds us of the diverse and far-reaching nature of human exploitation throughout history.